Khalil ibn Rashad stood at the edge of his family's ancient trading post, watching the last of his camels collapse in the merciless heat. For 7 generations, the Ibn Rashad family had prospered in this desert oasis, their caravans carrying precious goods between Damascus and the ports of the Arabian Gulf. But the drought that had gripped the land for 3 years was finally breaking their centuries-old legacy. The wells that had sustained his village since his great-grandfather's time were running dry, their water levels dropping daily despite the desperate prayers of the community. The date palms that had provided shade and sustenance were withering, their fronds turning brown and brittle. Most devastating of all, the trade routes that had made his family wealthy were being abandoned as other merchants sought more reliable sources of water and supplies. Khalil's wife, Amira, emerged from their home carrying their youngest son Yusuf, who had been crying from thirst and hunger. Their older children, Layla and Omar, sat listlessly in whatever shade they could find, their usual energy sapped by the relentless heat and diminishing food supply. "The Al-Mansouri family left this morning," Amira reported quietly, her voice hoarse from the dry air. "They've gone to live with relatives in Riyadh. Abu Hassan says he'll give us another week before he takes his family north to Jordan." Khalil nodded grimly, understanding the implications. When families started abandoning the oasis, it created a spiral of decline that was nearly impossible to reverse. Fewer people meant less trade, which meant less income to maintain the wells and infrastructure that kept the settlement viable. That evening, as Khalil performed his prayers facing Mecca, he found himself making desperate bargains with Allah. He promised to give half his wealth to charity, to make pilgrimage to the holy cities, to dedicate his life to serving the poor, anything to save his family and community from the slow death of abandonment and drought. But as the sun set over the endless dunes, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Khalil felt the weight of helplessness settling over him like the desert sand that infiltrated everything, no matter how tightly sealed. Chapter 2. The Stranger in the Storm. The sandstorm arrived without warning on the 4th night of Khalil's desperate prayers, a wall of wind and grit that turned day into night and forced every living creature to seek shelter. Khalil huddled with his family in their reinforced storage room, listening to the howling wind tear at their home's ancient wall. It was during the storm's peak, when the wind screamed like tortured spirits and sand found its way through every crack and crevice, that Khalil heard something impossible. A voice calling his name from outside, not shouting to be heard over the storm, but speaking in normal conversational tones that somehow reached his ears with perfect clarity. Against every instinct and his family's protests, Khalil wrapped himself in heavy robes and ventured into the maelstrom. The wind should have knocked him down immediately, but instead, it seemed to part around him, creating a pocket of relative calm as he followed the voice toward the village center. There, standing perfectly still in the eye of the swirling storm, was a figure unlike anyone Khalil had ever seen. Tall and lean, dressed in robes that seemed to be woven from the wind itself, the stranger's face was ageless and androgynous, with eyes that reflected the storm's lightning. "Khalil ibn Rashad," the figure said, and its voice carried the sound of wind through canyon walls. "I have heard your prayers. I have felt your desperation carried on every grain of sand. You seek salvation for your family, your people. Who are you?" Khalil managed to ask, though his voice was nearly lost in the storm's. "I am what your ancestors called the Keeper of the Desert Winds," the figure replied. "I am older than your civilization, older than the wells that sustain your oasis. I have watched empires rise and fall like sand dune, and I have the power to grant what you seek." The stranger gestured, and suddenly Khalil could see beyond the storm to a vision of his oasis transformed. Wells overflowing with crystal-clear water, date palms heavy with fruit, caravans lined up to trade at his prosperous market, his children laughing and playing in abundance. "All of this can be yours," the keeper said. "Unlimited wealth, endless water, prosperity beyond your wildest dreams. Your family name will be remembered for 1,000 generations." Khalil's heart raced with hope and suspicion. "What do you want in return?" The keeper smiled, and its expression was both beautiful and terrifying. "Something you will never miss. Something you have never valued. I want your shadow." Chapter 3. The Bargain Struck. Khalil stared at the Keeper of the Desert Winds, certain he had misheard over the storm's roar. "My shadow? That's all you want?" The mysterious figure nodded, its form seeming to shift and flow like sand. "And your shadow, freely given. It is a small price for the salvation of your people, is it not?" Khalil looked down at his own shadow, barely visible in the storm's chaos but still there, a dark outline cast by the lightning that flickered through the swirling sand. It seemed like such an insignificant thing, just the absence of light where his body blocked the sun. What possible value could it have? What would happen to me without it? Khalil asked, though even as he spoke, he was already leaning toward accepting the bargain. The vision of his family's prosperity was too compelling to resist. "You will live as you always have," the keeper assured him. "You will eat, sleep, work, love. Everything will be the same, except you will cast no shadow. A small inconvenience for unlimited wealth." The storm began to intensify around them, and Khalil felt the pressure of time. His family was suffering, his community was dying, and here was a solution to all their problems. What was a shadow compared to the lives of everyone? "How do I know you'll keep your word?" Khalil shouted over the increasing wind. The keeper extended its hand, and Khalil could see that it cast no shadow of its own. "Because I too once made this bargain. Long ago when the world was young, I understand what you sacrifice and the value of what you gain." Without allowing himself time for second thoughts, Khalil reached out and grasped the keeper's hand. The moment their skin touched, he felt something fundamental tear away, like a piece of his soul being gently but irrevocably. The sensation was neither painful nor pleasant, just profoundly strange, as if he had suddenly become lighter, but also somehow less complete. The storm began to subside immediately, and as the wind died down, Khalil looked at the ground where he stood. In the growing moonlight, he could see the shadows of rocks, plants, and debris scattered by the storm, but where his own shadow should have been, there was nothing but empty sand. "It is done," the keeper said, its voice already fading as it began to dissolve back into the... "Your prosperity begins with tomorrow's dawn. Remember our bargain, Khalil ibn Rashad, for it cannot be undone." Chapter 4. The Price of Prosperity. Dawn broke over the oasis with a beauty that Khalil had not seen in years. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool, and as the sun rose higher, something miraculous began to happen. The nearly dry wells started bubbling with fresh, clear water, rising higher than they had in decades. Khalil's family emerged from their shelter to find their date palms heavy with ripe fruit, their storage rooms mysteriously filled with grain and supplies, and their courtyards scattered with small leather pouches containing gold coins that seemed to have fallen from the sky during the storm. "It's a miracle," Amira whispered, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched their children drink deeply from the overflowing well. "Allah has answered our prayers." Khalil nodded and smiled, but something felt wrong. As his family celebrated around him, he noticed that while their shadows danced on the ground in the morning light, his own feet stood on unmarked sand. The absence of his shadow created a subtle but persistent sense of unease, like a song missing a crucial note. Within hours, word of the oasis's sudden prosperity spread throughout the region. Merchants who had abandoned the trade routes began returning, drawn by reports of unlimited water and generous hospitality. Khalil found himself able to offer deals so favorable that caravans lined up to trade at his market, bringing wealth that exceeded even the keeper's promises. But as the day progressed, Khalil began to notice other effects of his bargain. The sun, which had always provided welcome warmth in the desert, now felt oppressive and burning. Without his shadow to provide even the smallest relief, he found himself constantly seeking shade. But even in the coolest spots, he felt exposed and vulnerable. More disturbing was the reaction of animals to his presence. His camels, who had known him since birth, shied away when he approached. Dogs that had always been friendly began to bark and retreat. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over the area where he stood. That evening, as his family gathered to give thanks for their miraculous fortune, Khalil tried to join them in their prayers. But as he knelt facing Mecca, he felt a strange disconnection, as if his words were not reaching their intended destination. The spiritual comfort he had always found in prayer seemed muted and distant. Chapter 5. The Whispers Begin. As weeks passed and the oasis flourished beyond all expectations, Khalil's discomfort with his shadowless existence grew more pronounced. The physical effects were manageable. He learned to stay in shade during the hottest parts of the day, and to avoid situations where his lack of shadow might be noticed. But the psychological impact was far more troubling. The first whispers came during the third week after his bargain with the keeper. Khalil was conducting business with a caravan from Baghdad, when he heard a voice carried on the desert wind, speaking words that seemed meant only for him. "The shadow remembers what the man forgets." He looked around, but none of the merchants or travelers seemed to have heard anything unusual. The wind continued to blow normally, carrying the familiar scents of sand and distant rain, but the voice had been unmistakably real, and its words filled him with an inexplicable dread. The whispers became more frequent and more specific. During his afternoon rest, when the heat forced him to seek shelter, the wind would carry fragments of conversation. "The price grows heavier with each passing day. What is given cannot be taken back. The shadow holds the soul's true weight." Khalil tried to dismiss these voices as products of stress and guilt over his supernatural bargain, but they were accompanied by increasingly vivid dreams that left him exhausted each morning. In these dreams, he saw his shadow living a separate existence, wandering through landscapes of memory and regret, carrying burdens that Khalil himself no longer felt. The most disturbing aspect of his condition was the growing sense of emotional numbness. The joy he should have felt at his family's prosperity seemed muted, as if he were experiencing it through a thick veil. His love for Amira and his children remained, but it felt distant and intellectual rather than warm and immediate. His wife began to notice the change. "You seem different since the storm," she observed one evening as they sat together watching their children play in the courtyard. "Distracted, as if part of you is somewhere else." Khalil forced a smile and pulled her closer, but even her touch felt somehow less real than it had before. "I'm just overwhelmed by our good fortune," he lied. "It's hard to believe how quickly everything has changed." But privately, he was beginning to understand that the Keeper had taken far more than just his shadow. Something essential to his humanity was missing, and the whispers on the wind seemed to know exactly what it was. Chapter 6. The Shadow's Journey. The whispers on the wind began to tell Khalil stories about his shadow's separate existence, and these tales filled him with a mixture of fascination and horror. According to the voices that only he could hear, his shadow had not simply vanished, but had been set free to wander the world, experiencing everything that Khalil himself could no longer fully feel. "Your shadow weeps for the children who go hungry while you feast," the wind whispered during a particularly profitable day of trading. "It carries the weight of every coin you earn through supernatural means." Khalil learned that his shadow visited the families of merchants who had been ruined by his impossible success, standing vigil over their suffering while he slept peacefully in his prosperous home. It walked through the camps of refugees fleeing other droughts, experiencing their desperation with the full emotional intensity Khalil himself had lost. Most painfully, the wind told him that his shadow spent its nights in the presence of those who were dying alone, providing a comfort that Khalil could no longer offer because his capacity for deep empathy had been severed along with his connection to the darkness that follows light. These revelations began to poison Khalil's enjoyment of his wealth. Every meal tasted like ash when he thought of his shadow experiencing hunger on behalf of others. Every comfortable night's sleep was disturbed by knowledge that his shadow stood watch over the sleepless and afraid. The prosperity that had seemed like salvation now felt like a curse. His oasis had become the most successful trading post in the region, but Khalil found himself unable to take genuine pleasure in the achievement. The emotional distance that had initially seemed like a minor inconvenience was revealing itself to be a fundamental amputation of his humanity. His relationship with his family began to suffer as well. While he could still perform the actions of love, providing for them, protecting them, spending time with them, the deep emotional connection that had once made these actions meaningful was fading. He felt like an actor playing the role of himself, going through the motions of a life that no longer felt fully real. The wind's whispers became more insistent. The shadow grows stronger while the man grows hollow. What feeds on light starves in darkness. The price of prosperity is the poverty of the soul. Khalil began to understand that he had not simply traded his shadow for wealth, he had traded his capacity for authentic human experience for material success. Chapter 7. The Community's Suspicion. As Khalil's supernatural prosperity continued to grow, members of his community began to notice disturbing details about their benefactor. The first to voice suspicions was old Abu Mahmud, the village's unofficial wise man, who had lived through 8 decades of desert life and claimed to recognize the signs of unnatural fortune. "Have you noticed," Abu Mahmud asked a gathering of village elders, "that Khalil ibn Rashad casts no shadow, even in the brightest sunlight?" The other men initially dismissed this observation as the rambling of an old man whose eyes were failing. But once the idea was planted, they began to pay attention, and what they saw filled them with unease. In a culture where shadows were considered proof of the soul's presence, a man without a shadow was viewed with deep suspicion. The animal's behavior toward Khalil became another source of concern. Camels that had known him for years now refused to approach him willingly. Dogs that had once greeted him with enthusiasm now cowered or fled when he appeared. Even the birds seemed to avoid the areas where he conducted business. Children, with their innocent perception, were the first to openly express their fear. "Mama," little Fatima asked her mother after Khalil had visited their family, "why doesn't Uncle Khalil have a shadow like everyone else? Is he a jinn?" The whispers about Khalil's supernatural nature spread through the community like wildfire. Some believed he had made a pact with evil spirits. Others thought he had been possessed by a jinn. A few suggested that he had died during the Great Storm and been replaced by something that only resembled him. These suspicions created a painful irony. His supernatural wealth had saved the community from drought and abandonment, but his lack of shadow was making him an outcast among the very people he had sacrificed to help. The prosperity he had brought them was tainted by their growing fear of its source. The situation reached a crisis point when the village imam, Sheikh Hassan, requested a private meeting with Khalil. The elderly religious leader had been observing the strange circumstances surrounding Khalil's sudden fortune and had reached troubling conclusions. "My son," Sheikh Hassan said carefully, "the community is grateful for the prosperity you have brought us. But there are questions that must be answered. The way you acquired this wealth, the timing of the storm, your changed nature. These things suggest supernatural intervention." Khalil felt trapped between honesty and self-preservation. He could not reveal the truth about his bargain with the keeper, without confirming his community's worst fears about dealing with supernatural. Chapter 8. The Weight of Isolation. The growing suspicion and fear from his community drove Khalil deeper into isolation, even as his material wealth continued to expand beyond all reasonable limits. Caravans arrived daily seeking to trade at his oasis, drawn by reports of his generous terms and unlimited resources, but the local residents increasingly avoided him. His family remained loyal, but even they began to notice the changes in him that went beyond his missing shadow. Amira observed that he no longer laughed with genuine joy, that his smiles seemed forced, and that he often stared into the distance as if listening to voices only he could hear. "You've given us everything we could want," she said one evening as they sat in their expanded courtyard, surrounded by the luxury his supernatural wealth had provided. "But I feel like I'm losing the man I married. You're here with us in body, but your spirit seems to be somewhere else." Khalil wanted to explain, to share the burden of his knowledge about the Shadow's separate existence and the price he was paying for their prosperity. But how could he tell his beloved wife that he had traded away part of his soul? How could he admit that every day he felt less capable of the deep love that had once defined their relationship? The wind's whispers had become constant companions, providing a running commentary on his emotional emptiness. The shadow feels what the man cannot. Love without depth is mere performance. The heart that casts no shadow beats without true rhythm. His children, too young to understand the supernatural nature of their father's condition, simply knew that something fundamental had changed. Omar, his eldest son, asked him one day, "Baba, why do you seem sad even when good things happen?" The question pierced Khalil more deeply than any accusation from the village elders. His son had identified the core of his dilemma. He was living a life of unprecedented success while being unable to fully experience the emotions that should accompany such fortune. Sleep became increasingly elusive as the wind's whispers grew more detailed about his shadow's experience. He learned that his shadow had visited the grave of a merchant who had committed suicide after being ruined by competition with Khalil's supernaturally advantaged business. It had stood vigil over a widow whose husband had died, trying to find water during the drought that Khalil had escaped through his bargain. Each night brought new stories of his shadow bearing witness to suffering that Khalil himself could no longer fully comprehend or feel, creating a growing sense of moral debt that his material wealth could never repay. Chapter 9. The Keeper's Return. On the anniversary of the great storm that had changed his life, Khalil found himself standing alone in the desert at midnight, listening to the wind's whisper and contemplating the true cost of his bargain. The oasis behind him glowed with prosperity, electric lights powered by generators he could easily afford, the sound of flowing water from wells that never ran dry, the voices of his family sleeping peacefully in their expanded home. But Khalil felt more alone than he had during the darkest days of the drought. The emotional numbness that had initially seemed like a minor side effect of losing his shadow had grown into a profound disconnection from everything that had once given his life meaning. It was then that the wind began to swirl around him familiar patterns, and the keeper of the desert winds materialized from the darkness, appearing exactly as it had 1 year before. "You seem troubled, Khalil ibn Rashad," the keeper observed, its ageless face showing what might have been amused. "I trust you have found our bargain satisfactory. Your wealth exceeds that of kings. Your family wants for nothing. Your community prospers." "I have everything I asked for," Khalil replied carefully, "but I'm beginning to understand what I didn't ask for. You took more than my shadow. You took my ability to fully experience the life I was trying to save." The keeper nodded slowly. "The shadow is not merely the absence of light. It is the repository of depth, of emotional weight, of the capacity to truly feel both joy and sorrow. Without it, you experience life as a shallow reflection of what it once was." "Why didn't you tell me this before I agreed? Would you have chosen differently?" the keeper asked. "Your family was dying. Your community was abandoning the oasis. Your legacy was crumbling to dust. Would you have chosen to let them suffer so that you could maintain your full emotional range?" Khalil considered the question honestly. Even knowing what he knew now, the choice was not clear. His sacrifice had saved everyone he loved, but it had cost him the ability to fully love them in return. "Is there a way to undo the bargain?" he asked. The keeper's expression grew serious. "There is, but the price would be higher than what you originally paid. To reclaim your shadow, you would need to give up not just the wealth you have gained, but also sacrifice something of equal value to what you have received. What do you mean? Your shadow has grown heavy with the suffering it has witnessed on your behalf. To reclaim it, you must be willing to bear that weight yourself. Chapter 10. The Shadow's Burden. The keeper's words hung in the desert air like a challenge and a warning. Khalil understood that reclaiming his shadow would mean more than simply reversing his supernatural wealth. It would require him to experience all at once every moment of suffering that his shadow had witnessed during their year of separation. "Show me," Khalil said, his voice steady despite his fear. "Show me what my shadow has carried." The keeper gestured, and suddenly Khalil could see his shadow as clearly as if it were standing before him in the moonlight. But this shadow was not the simple dark outline he remembered. It was heavy and substantial, weighted down with the accumulated grief, guilt, and pain of countless encounters with suffering. Through the keeper's power, Khalil experienced a year's worth of his shadow's journey in a series of overwhelming visions. He felt the despair of the merchant who had lost everything to Khalil's supernatural competition. He experienced the hunger of children whose families had been displaced by the economic disruption his success had caused in distant markets. Most painfully, he felt the deep loneliness and fear of people who were dying alone while he slept peacefully in his prosperous home, unaware of their suffering because his capacity for empathy had been severed along with his shadow. The emotional weight was crushing. Khalil fell to his knees in the sand, overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings he had been unable to experience for an entire year. The numbness that had protected him from fully comprehending the consequences of his actions was stripped away, leaving him vulnerable to the full impact of his shadow's accumulated burden. "This is what you claim," the keeper said, its voice neither kind nor cruel, simply factual. "Your shadow has become a repository of all the pain your prosperity has caused, directly and indirectly. To be whole again, you must accept responsibility for this suffering." Khalil struggled to speak through the overwhelming emotion. "And if I choose to reclaim it, you will lose the supernatural wealth, but you will regain your full humanity. You will feel joy and sorrow with equal intensity. You will be able to love your family with the depth you once knew, but you will also carry the weight of knowledge about the price of your year of prosperity." The choice was agonizing. Khalil could return to his family and continue living as a wealthy but emotionally hollow man, or he could reclaim his full humanity at the cost of their material security and his own peace of mind. As he knelt in the sand, feeling the full weight of his shadow's burden, Khalil realized that the choice had already been made. A life without the capacity for deep feeling was not truly a life at all. Chapter 11. The Return to Wholeness. "I choose to reclaim my shadow," Khalil said, his voice firm despite the tears streaming down his face. "I choose to be whole, whatever the cost." The keeper nodded solemnly. "Then prepare yourself, Khalil ibn Rashad. The reunion will be painful, but it will also be a rebirth." The wind began to swirl around them with increasing intensity, and Khalil watched as his shadow began to move toward him across the sand. With each step it took, he felt the return of emotional capacity he had lost, first as a trickle, then as a flood that threatened to overwhelm him. The moment his shadow merged with his body was like being struck by lightning made of pure feeling. Every emotion he had been unable to fully experience during the past year crashed over him simultaneously. Love for his family, guilt over the suffering his prosperity had caused, grief for those who had died while he prospered, and a profound gratitude for the simple ability to feel deeply. As the emotional storm subsided, Khalil looked around and saw that the supernatural signs of his wealth were already beginning to fade. The electric lights in his oasis flickered and went dark. The sound of flowing water from the wells grew quieter. The leather pouches of gold that had appeared magically in his home would be gone by morning. But as he stood up and looked down at the sand beneath his feet, he saw his shadow clearly outlined in whole, present, and unmistakably his own. The relief he felt was indescribable, like a man who had been holding his breath for a year, finally being able to breathe freely. "The bargain is complete," the keeper said, already beginning to fade back into, "You have chosen wisdom over wealth, depth over comfort. Your shadow will never leave you again, but neither will the knowledge of what you have learned." As the keeper disappeared, Khalil began the walk back to his oasis, knowing that he would arrive to find his family facing the same challenges they had known before the supernatural. The wells would be running low again, the date palms would be struggling, and the difficult work of survival in the desert would resume. But he would face these challenges as a complete man, capable of experiencing both the hardships and the joys of life with full emotional depth. He would love his family with the intensity he lost, and he would work to rebuild their prosperity through honest means, accepting whatever suffering that path might bring. As he walked across the sand, his shadow moved with him, a constant reminder of the weight of being fully human, but also a sign of his wholeness and his capacity for authentic connection with the world around him. The desert wind still whispered, but now its voice carried messages of hope rather than regret. The shadow and the man are one. What is earned through sacrifice has lasting value. The soul that casts a shadow knows its own true weight. Khalil smiled, feeling the expression reach his eyes for the first time in a year, and continued his journey home to face whatever challenges awaited him as a whole and authentic human being.